It started with the sound of tires crunching on gravel in the dead of night, a noise so out of place on my quiet ranch road that it jolted me awake before my alarm even had the chance. I had bought this land years ago, pouring every drop of sweat and every cent I had into making it a home, a place where I could live away from the constant noise and rules of the city. Out here, the air was clearer, the nights darker, and the only sounds I was used to were the soft calls of coyotes in the distance or the wind rattling the dry grass against the fence posts. But lately, that peaceful quiet had been broken more times than I could count, all thanks to my neighbor, a woman who had quickly earned the nickname HOA Karen in my mind, and her insistence that my property was nothing more than her personal shortcut. At first, it was just the occasional truck passing through during the day. I'd see the dust cloud in the distance as I worked the cattle, and I'd shrug it off, figuring maybe she got turned around or had an emergency. But it kept happening, over and over, and each time she'd drive through like she owned the place, waving that smug little wave like she was doing me a favor by not stopping to chat. My gate, a sturdy steel one I had installed myself, had been left open twice, and once I found it hanging from a single hinge like someone had rammed it too hard. That was the day I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own, and that if I didn't do something about it, she was going to cost me more than just a gate. I grew up respecting land. My old man had drilled it into me from a young age that fences were sacred. You didn't cross another man's fence without asking permission, and you sure as hell didn't go breaking gates because you were too lazy to take the long way around. Out here, a gate isn't just a decoration, it keeps livestock in, keeps predators out, and it's the thin line between order and chaos. So when I saw my gate broken, I felt that old fire in my chest that I hadn't felt since my military days. I got to work right away, welding it back into place, reinforcing the hinges, and even adding a new chain and padlock. But I knew in my gut that this wasn't going to be the last time I saw her Jeep tearing down my road. Sure enough, 2 days later, I heard the same crunch of gravel, the same whine of tires, and when I stepped out onto my porch, there she was, bold as brass, sitting in the driver's seat with her sunglasses on like she was cruising through some suburban cul-de-sac. I raised my hand to stop her, but she just waved again and kept driving. My blood boiled. I shouted after her that this was private property, that she had no right to be here, but all I got was the sound of her engine fading into the distance. When I walked back to the gate later that evening, the lock was gone. Not broken, gone. She had actually cut the damn thing clean off. I called the sheriff's office to report it, figuring they'd at least send a deputy to have a word with her, but the guy on the phone just sighed like he'd heard it all before and told me that unless I caught her in the act and had proof, there wasn't much they could do. Proof. That word stuck in my head as I drove into town the next day to pick up supplies. If it was proof they needed, proof I would get. I bought a couple of trail cameras, the kind hunters used to track deer, and set them up near the gate, angled so they'd catch every car, license plate, and face that came through. Over the next week, I gathered plenty of proof. She wasn't just coming through once in a while. She was using my road daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and even worse, she had started bringing friends with her. There were trucks, SUVs, even a convertible once, all of them flying through like they were on a racetrack, kicking up dust that settled on my water troughs and hay bales. One video even caught her stopping in the middle of the road to let her dog out, letting the mutt run all over my property before loading it back into the car and driving off. That was the last straw for me. I confronted her the following Sunday when I saw her heading my way. I parked my truck sideways across the road, forcing her to stop, and walked right up to her window. She rolled it down just far enough to look at me over her sunglasses, her lip curled into a smirk. I told her plain and simple that this was private land, not a public road, and that she had no right to be driving through here. She laughed, actually laughed, and told me that the road had been used as a shortcut for years, long before I even bought the place, and that I was being unneighborly by trying to block it off. I told her I didn't give a damn what people used to do, it was my land now, and I had the right to control who came and went. She shrugged and told me good luck stopping her. That was it. No apology, no compromise, just that smug little smirk as she drove off, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with the trail cam footage pulled up on my laptop, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to waste any more time arguing with her, and I wasn't going to keep running into town to buy new locks every time she decided to play demolition derby with my gate. If she wanted to play games, fine, I was going to play too, but I was going to make damn sure I won. I started sketching out a plan right there on a napkin, a plan that would teach her a lesson without getting me into trouble with the law. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about respect, for my property, for my hard work, for the rules that keep this place running. By the time the sun came up, I had a full design drawn out, a list of materials, and a grin on my face that hadn't been there in weeks. The next morning, I headed out before dawn, loading the truck bed with everything I thought I might need: new posts, fresh wire, a few motion-activated floodlights, and a couple of old farm tricks I hadn't used in years. This wasn't just about closing a gate anymore. This was about sending a message that would stick in her memory every time she even thought about using my road. I spent the first half of the day reinforcing the gate again, welding a new frame and making sure the steel posts were buried so deep that it would take a tank to knock them loose. Then came the chain, not just some hardware store lock this time, but a heavy-duty logging chain with a keyed lock that could hold back a herd of bulls if I needed it to. By the time I was finished, the gate was stronger than it had ever been. But that was only the first step. The real trap was still to come. After lunch, I dug 2 narrow trenches a few feet inside the gate, running them across the road just wide enough to fit some cattle grates I had lying around in the barn. Most people from the city don't know what a cattle grate is. It's basically a metal grid that livestock won't cross because they're afraid their hooves will get stuck in the gaps. I installed those grates just deep enough so that any car that tried to ram the gate would end up with its front wheels dropping hard into the trench, killing its momentum before it even touched the steel. It wasn't enough to wreck the car. I wasn't about to get myself sued, but it would definitely stop anyone from blasting through at top speed. I covered them lightly with dirt and gravel so they looked like part of the road. While I worked, I kept thinking about Karen's face when I had confronted her last time. That smirk, that dismissive laugh, it fueled me to keep going. If she thought she could intimidate me into letting her have her way, she had another thing coming. I also mounted the trail cameras higher up on posts, making sure they had a wide-angle view of the whole road, so there would be no denying what happened next time she tried something. I even wired the cameras to a solar battery pack so they wouldn't run out of juice. When I finished up that evening, I sat on my porch with a cold beer and just waited. Sure enough, just before dark, I heard the sound of her Jeep again. She came flying down the road like always, headlights bouncing, music thumping. But this time, when she saw the new gate in her way, she didn't even slow down, she gunned it. I couldn't believe my eyes as I watched her tires hit the cattle grates and sink just enough to jolt the Jeep violently. The sound of her undercarriage scraping made me wince, but I'll admit there was a certain satisfaction in hearing that thud. She slammed on the brakes just short of the gate, sat there for a moment, then reversed back out, spinning her wheels as she went. I knew right then that this wasn't over. The next morning, I drove out to check the cameras and sure enough, there it was, crystal clear footage of her nearly wrecking her Jeep. I made copies and saved them on a USB stick, just in case. Later that afternoon, I saw her walking up my driveway. Not driving, walking. She looked madder than a wet hen, her face red, her hair a mess, and her hands waving in the air as she came storming toward me. I stepped off the porch and met her halfway, keeping my face calm. She started shouting before I could even open my mouth, accusing me of sabotaging the road, of endangering her vehicle, of being a terrible neighbor. I let her get it all out before I calmly told her that she had no legal right to be on my land, that she had ignored my warnings, and that if she tried it again, I'd take the footage to the sheriff and press charges for trespassing and destruction of property. That stopped her in her tracks. She blinked, stunned that I had actual proof, then tried to change tactics, saying she had an easement right because the road had been used for years. I told her flat out there was no record of any easement on my deed, I had checked when I bought the property, and that if she wanted to challenge it, she could take me to court. Her mouth opened like she was about to fire back, but nothing came out. Finally, she turned on her heel and stomped back down the driveway. For a few days, it was quiet. I started to think maybe I had finally gotten through to her. But then, one night around midnight, my phone buzzed with an alert from the trail cameras. I pulled up the feed and my blood ran cold. There were 3 vehicles at the gate this time, 2 trucks, and that same Jeep, and a group of people standing around with flashlights. One of them was holding what looked like bolt cutters. I grabbed my rifle, hopped into my truck, and drove down there as fast as I could. When I crested the hill, my headlights lit them up like deer in a field. They froze for a split second, then scattered, jumping into their vehicles and tearing off in the other direction. When I got to the gate, I saw they had managed to cut halfway through the chain before I showed up. That was it. I had been patient, I had tried talking, I had reinforced the gate, but now they were escalating, and that meant I had to escalate too. I spent the next morning calling a buddy of mine who runs a fabrication shop. Together, we designed something special, a remote-controlled gate system with a steel frame and hydraulic lock, the kind you usually see on high-security ranches or even military bases. It cost me a pretty penny, but it was worth every cent. When we installed it, I also added a couple of motion-activated sprinklers just behind the gate. Anyone who got too close without authorization was going to get a high-pressure shower of ice-cold water. It wasn't just about keeping her out anymore. It was about making sure she thought twice before ever coming near my property again. The following week passed with a strange kind of quiet, the kind that makes you suspicious rather than relieved. My cameras didn't pick up a single car, no tire tracks appeared on the road, and even the sound of distant traffic on the county highway seemed to vanish. I kept busy around the ranch, tending to the herd and mending fences, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen and her little gang of trespassers were cooking up something bigger. She didn't strike me as the type to just give up, not after the way she had tried to stand her ground. People like her didn't back down easily, they doubled down. I knew I had to stay ready. Every night before bed, I made it a habit to check the feed from my cameras, to make sure the hydraulic gate was locked and the system armed. Each time, the screens showed nothing but empty road, silent under the moonlight. Then came Friday night. It was just after 10 when the first alert hit my phone, a motion trigger on camera 1. At first, I figured it was a coyote or maybe one of my neighbor's stray dogs, but then another alert hit, and another, and by the time I opened the app, my stomach dropped. There were 5 vehicles this time. 5 trucks, SUVs, headlights shining like spotlights, engines idling low. They were lined up just outside the gate, and I could see people moving around, silhouetted by the beams. My new gate was holding strong, but I knew what was coming. I could see the glint of metal in one guy's hands, probably another set of bolt cutters, and another man had what looked like a heavy-duty chain hooked to the back of his truck, like they were planning to just yank the whole gate out of the ground. I grabbed my rifle and jumped into my truck, heart hammering. As I drove down, I hit the remote on my visor that controlled the new hydraulic gate system. It powered itself into lockdown mode, locking the frame to the ground and making it nearly impossible to pull loose without heavy machinery. By the time I crested the hill, I could see them clearly, a whole crew of people now, including Karen, standing in the middle of the road like she was the queen of the damn county. My headlights lit them up, and just as I expected, they didn't run this time. They stood their ground. That's when I decided to put the new system to the test. I hit the second button on the remote, and the sprinklers roared to life with a hiss, spraying ice-cold well water in a wide arc right over the gate. It was like turning a fire hose on them. The first blast hit Karen square in the chest, knocking her backward a step, and the rest of the crew scrambled, shouting as they got soaked. I could hear the high-pitched squeal of someone's dog as it bolted into the dark. They were drenched within seconds, slipping and sliding in the mud as they tried to scramble back to their vehicles. I kept the lights of my truck trained on them, not saying a word, just letting the scene play out like something out of a movie. Finally, Karen screamed over the noise, shouting something about calling the police. I leaned out of my window and shouted back that I'd be happy to call them myself, that I had footage of them trespassing, vandalizing, and attempting to destroy private property. That shut her up real fast. One of the men grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the Jeep, yelling that they should go before things got worse. Within minutes, the whole convoy had turned tail and was gone, engines roaring as they sped back toward the highway. When the road was clear again, I shut off the sprinklers and got out to check the gate. It had held perfectly, not a scratch on it. The hydraulic locks had done their job, and the cameras had captured every single second of the confrontation in full HD. I stood there for a long moment, soaking in the quiet, the smell of wet dirt rising into the night air. I had won this round, and it felt damn good. But my victory was short-lived. The next day, I got a letter in the mail. Not just any letter, an official-looking envelope with legal lettering across the top. Inside was a formal complaint, filed by Karen and her husband, claiming that I was illegally restricting access to a public thoroughfare and creating unsafe conditions with my gate. They were threatening to take me to court, demanding that I remove the gate immediately and pay for the damage to their Jeep. My blood boiled as I read it. Not only were they trespassing, but now they were trying to flip the blame back on me. I drove straight into town that afternoon, letter in hand, and went straight to the county clerk's office. I asked to see the deed to my property and any recorded easements. The clerk pulled the file, flipped through it, and confirmed exactly what I already knew. There was no easement, no public right-of-way, nothing giving anyone permission to cross my land. Armed with that paperwork, I headed straight to the sheriff's office. This time, I didn't just report what happened, I handed over the USB drive with all the camera footage, including the latest showdown at the gate. The deputy watched it all play out, nodding slowly, and told me that this was more than enough to press charges for trespassing and attempted destruction of property. He even said he'd personally deliver a warning to Karen's house. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, knowing that I finally had the law on my side. But I also knew Karen, she wasn't going to take this lying down. She was the type to push and push until she either got what she wanted or burned everything down trying. So I doubled down again. I added 2 more cameras, one hidden in the trees to catch anyone trying to sneak around the gate, and another one facing back toward my house, just in case they decided to retaliate. I also installed a loud alarm system on the gate. Anyone who tried to cut the chain or force it open would trigger a siren loud enough to wake the dead. 3 nights later, the alarm went off. The siren wailed through the night, and I bolted upright in bed, grabbing my boots and rifle. When I got to the gate, I didn't see Karen this time, just 2 young guys, probably friends of hers, who had apparently been dared to try and cut the chain again. They froze when they saw my truck barreling toward them and took off running into the fields. I let them go, knowing the cameras had caught them clear as day. When I replayed the footage later, I realized this wasn't just about a road anymore. This had turned into a full-blown battle of wills, and I was determined to be the last man standing. The morning after the siren scare, I drove into town again, this time with a folder stuffed with printed screenshots from my cameras and a copy of the property deed. I wasn't going to wait for this to get worse, I was going to go on the offensive. At the sheriff's office, I filed formal trespassing charges against the 2 men who had tried to cut my chain and added Karen's name to the complaint as the instigator. The deputy told me that she would be served with a notice to appear in court and that if she or anyone else set foot on my land again without permission, I had every right to have them arrested on the spot. That was the first time I felt like the law was truly on my side, and as I drove back home, a grim kind of satisfaction settled over me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't just back down because someone told them to. They had to be humiliated before they'd ever leave you alone. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the moon rise over the fields, thinking about all the months of frustration, the broken gates, the dust clouds, the endless disrespect. It wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about the principle of the thing. I had poured years of my life into this ranch, building it up from nothing, working sunup to sundown, and here was this entitled woman treating it like a public shortcut because it saved her 5 minutes of drive time. I wasn't just going to stop her, I was going to make damn sure she'd never even think about doing it again. That's when I started building the final stage of my trap. I spent the next 2 days out by the gate, digging, measuring, welding. I laid a second set of cattle grates, this time deeper and wider, and installed reinforced tire spikes that could be retracted by remote control. I buried pressure sensors just inside the entrance so I'd know the second anyone tried to cross. And, for good measure, I rigged a set of motion-triggered floodlights that lit up the entire road like a football field. If anyone came through uninvited, it would feel like they had just broken into a prison yard. By the time I was finished, the setup was more secure than some government facilities. The gate had been reinforced again with a steel crossbar that could only be unlocked from my remote, and the whole system ran off a solar-charged battery backup, meaning even a power outage wouldn't shut it down. It wasn't cheap, but to me, the peace of mind was worth it. 2 days later, Karen struck again. It was just past dusk when my phone buzzed. Not just one alert this time but all of them at once. I opened the camera feed and there she was, in her Jeep, headlights blazing, followed by 2 trucks. They stopped at the gate, and I could see her get out, yelling something I couldn't hear over the camera mic. One of the men with her started trying to hook a chain to the frame again. I grabbed my keys and drove down, this time with my remote ready. When I crested the hill, I saw them bathed in the glow of my floodlights. I slowed just enough to watch what would happen next. As soon as the man hooked the chain and gave the signal for the truck to start pulling, I hit the button on the remote. The tire spikes shot up in an instant. The truck lurched forward, then stopped dead as both its front tires deflated with a loud hiss. The man jumped back, cursing, while Karen spun around toward me as I rolled to a stop. I stepped out of my truck and walked up slowly, rifle slung but not raised. "This ends tonight," I said, my voice low and even. "I've warned you, I've got footage, and now I've got proof you're destroying property. You've got two choices: leave right now and never come back, or wait here while I call the sheriff and have you arrested." For the first time since this whole thing started, she didn't have a comeback. She stood there dripping with anger, her fists clenched, but she didn't speak. One of the men muttered something about not wanting to get hauled off to jail, and after a long pause, she turned and stalked back to her Jeep. The trucks followed, limping along with their flat tires, and just like that, they were gone. I didn't relax until I heard from the sheriff the next day that Karen had been officially served with the trespassing complaint and that a hearing date had been set. When the day came, I walked into the county courthouse with my evidence folder in hand. Karen was there with her husband, looking sour and smug all at once, like she still believed she could win. But the judge didn't waste much time. He reviewed the footage, looked over my deed, and ruled in my favor on the spot. Not only was I legally allowed to keep my gate, but Karen was ordered to pay for the damage her group had caused, including the replacement locks, the welding work, and even the landscaping that had been torn up by their trucks. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Justice had been served, and for once, I didn't feel like I was fighting this battle alone. When I got back home, I sat on the porch with a cold drink, looking out toward the gate in the distance. For the first time in a long while, the road was quiet. No dust clouds, no tire tracks, no engines. Just peace. But I left the trap in place, just in case. Weeks passed after the court case, and the silence around my ranch became the kind of quiet I had dreamed of when I first bought this land. The road stayed empty, the cameras captured nothing but deer and the occasional wandering coyote, and my mornings were filled with nothing more stressful than feeding cattle and fixing the usual wear and tear that comes with ranch life. For a while, I almost forgot what it felt like to constantly check over my shoulder, to brace myself every time I heard an engine. But Karen was never far from my mind. People like her have a way of sticking to you, like a burr that keeps catching on your jeans no matter how many times you try to brush it off. I half expected her to try something else, some last desperate stunt to get back at me for embarrassing her in court. Then, one morning, I got my answer. A white envelope showed up in my mailbox, not a legal notice this time, but a handwritten letter. The handwriting was neat but tense, like every word had been pressed too hard into the paper. It was from Karen. She didn't apologize, not outright, but she said she was done fighting and would respect the court's decision. She also claimed she had sold her house and would be moving out of the community. I read that line twice, then 3 times, until it finally sank in. She was leaving. The woman who had made my life hell for months, the one who thought she could bulldoze over my property rights and treat me like an obstacle in her way, was finally packing up and going somewhere else to be someone else's problem. A few days later, I watched from my porch as a moving truck rolled down the highway, followed by that familiar Jeep. They didn't come down my road, didn't even slow near my gate, they just kept driving until they were gone. I can't lie, there was a deep, soul-satisfying sense of victory in that moment. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the fact that I had stood my ground, that I hadn't let her push me off my own land or scare me into submission. The ranch was mine, and now it was truly mine again, free of her interference. Over the next few weeks, I started taking down some of the extra security I'd built up. I left the hydraulic gate, of course, that had proven to be worth every penny, but I removed the extra alarms and cameras facing back toward the house. I didn't need to feel like I was living under siege anymore. My evenings went back to being peaceful, with me sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, the sky turning gold and purple as the cattle grazed quietly in the distance. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. But I also learned something from all of this. I learned that standing up for what's yours isn't always easy, and it's rarely quick. It takes patience, persistence, and sometimes a little bit of cleverness to outmaneuver people who think they can walk all over you. The trap I set wasn't just a physical one, it was a lesson, a boundary that said, this far, no farther. And it worked. It reminded me that when you live out here, far from the city and its endless noise, you have to be your own protector, your own sheriff, your own judge. Months later, I was in town when I ran into one of Karen's former neighbors at the feed store. He told me she had moved 2 counties over and was already fighting with the new homeowners association there over something to do with fences and property lines. I couldn't help but laugh. Some people never change. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I paid for my feed, loaded it in the truck, and drove back to my ranch, smiling the whole way. When I pulled through my gate that evening, the sun was just dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the gravel road. I parked the truck, walked up to the gate, and ran my hand over the smooth steel frame. It had been through a lot, we both had, but it was still standing. So was I. That night, I built a small fire out near the gate, sat in my favorite chair, and watched the stars come out one by one. The silence was back, but now it felt earned. Hard-won. Every crunch of gravel under my boots reminded me that this was my land, my home, and no one was going to take that from me. Not Karen, not anyone.